Everything you think you know about the Vikings is wrong. The tall, blonde, blue-eyed warrior, the pure Scandinavian bloodline, the sea of identical giants pouring out of the north. It is one of the most powerful images in all of history, and ancient DNA has just proven that almost none of it is true. The real Vikings look different, came from different places, and were never the single pure people the legend promised. And the proof was hiding inside their bones the entire time. For more than 1,000 years, the myth held. Fair hair, pale eyes, a warrior race sealed off at the top of the map, untouched by the rest of the world. That image is everywhere, from old paintings to modern television. But it was never built on evidence. It was built on imagination, on national pride, and in the darkest chapters of the last century, on ideology. Nobody had ever checked it against the one source that cannot lie: the bodies themselves. Then, a few years ago, scientists did exactly that. Professor Eske Willerslev and his team spent 6 years pulling genetic material out of the bones of 442 people who had lived, raided, and been buried more than 1,000 years ago. The results, published in Nature in 2020, came from over 80 archaeological sites across Scandinavia, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, Estonia, Ukraine, and beyond. Many were buried in full Viking style, with Viking swords, in Viking graves. By every outward sign, these were Vikings. The only question left was what their DNA would say. And when the results came back, they tore the legend apart. Start with the part everyone is most certain about: the hair. The blonde Viking feels less like a stereotype and more like a fact. But when researchers read the genes that control pigmentation, they found that dark hair was more common among Viking-age Scandinavians than it is in the same region today. The idea of a uniform wave of golden-haired warriors simply does not survive contact with the evidence. The single most recognizable feature of the Viking stereotype is one of the first things the science knocks down. But hair color is just the surface. When researchers examined the ancestry woven into these remains, they found that genes had been flowing into Scandinavia from the outside the entire time. DNA from the British Isles, from Ireland, from the Eastern Baltic, from Southern Europe. These were not Scandinavian bloodlines, and yet there they were, carried in people buried during the Viking Age itself. The Vikings were not a sealed, isolated population. They were a crossroads, with people moving in just as much as they were sailing out. At the very moment Scandinavians were raiding England and settling Iceland, people from those distant lands were arriving in Scandinavia and leaving their mark. Some were traders, some were missionaries, and some, we have to be honest, were almost certainly enslaved people carried back against their will. The supposedly pure homeland of the Vikings was already a mixing pot of the wider world. And then comes the discovery that shatters the myth completely. In the islands of Orkney, off the northern coast of Scotland, archaeologists found graves that looked unmistakably Viking. The bodies were buried with Viking swords, in full Viking fashion. For decades, the assumption was obvious. These were Norse settlers who had crossed the sea. But when their DNA was read, it told a completely different story. These people carried almost no Scandinavian ancestry at all. Genetically, they were nearly identical to the local population, to present-day Irish and Scottish people. They were likely Picts, a Celtic-speaking people native to Scotland. So here were individuals with two genetically British parents, buried as Vikings, with Viking weapons in Viking graves. They were not Norse by blood, not even slightly, and yet, by every cultural measure, they were Vikings. This is the single most important result of the entire study, and it lands like a hammer on the old legend. Being a Viking was not something written in your blood. It was something you could join. A culture, a way of life, an identity that could spread to people who shared none of the bloodline we spent 1,000 years assuming was essential to it. The pure Viking race was not just rare, it never existed. There is a haunting detail in this research that brings the whole thing down to a human scale. In the Salm ship burial in Estonia, scientists found 4 brothers who had died on the very same day. 4 siblings, lost together, probably in a single raid gone wrong, laid to rest side by side in the boat that had carried them. The rest of the crew were genetically similar to one another, which suggests they had all come from the same small town somewhere in Sweden. These were not mythical giants. They were young men from one community who climbed into a boat together and never came home. The DNA gives them back their humanity in a way no legend ever could. The study also revealed that the Vikings were never one people to begin with. There was no single unified Norse race. Researchers found clear genetic differences between Viking groups in different parts of Scandinavia, sharper than anyone expected. A Viking from what is now Sweden could be genetically distinct from one in Norway or Denmark. There was no one Viking. There were Vikings, plural, each with their own genetic fingerprint. The legacy of all this mixing is still inside millions of people today. Around 6% of people in the United Kingdom carry Viking DNA, compared to roughly 10% in Sweden. It is written not just in blood, but in place names, surnames, and the boundaries of the Old Danelaw, the vast stretch of northern and eastern England that Norse settlers once governed under their own laws. And here is the final twist, the one that turns the purity myth completely on its head. When scientists compared Viking-age Scandinavians to people living in Scandinavia today, they found that some of that foreign ancestry is actually less common now than it was back then. The people of the Viking Age were, in some regions, more genetically diverse than modern Scandinavians are. The mixing the Vikings set in motion was so dramatic that the centuries since have, in some places, diluted it rather than added to it. This was not a story of an isolated people staying pure. It was one of the great mixing events in European history. So why does the lie survive? Part of it is that the myth is powerful. It is clean, it is dramatic, it makes for a good story, but part of it is far more troubling. The idea of a pure, ancestral Northern European people has been twisted into ideologies that the actual science flatly contradicts. The horned helmet was always a fantasy. The pure bloodline was a fantasy too. And the quiet power of this research is that it does not just correct a historical detail, it dismantles a myth that was dangerous precisely because it was never true. What the ancient DNA reveals, in the end, is far more interesting than the legend. The Vikings were a culture, not a bloodline, a way of life that pulled in people from across the known world. The raider who terrified the monasteries, the trader in the marketplace, and the Pictish farmer buried with a borrowed sword were all, in their own way, Vikings. Not because of what was in their blood, but because of how they chose to live. So the next time you picture a Viking, do not picture a single blonde face. Picture a crossroads. Picture 4 brothers in a boat. Picture a continent of people moving, mixing, and remaking themselves. That is who the Vikings really were. The myth was a lie, and the truth, written in their bones, is far more fascinating than the legend ever allowed. Thank you for watching.